Thank you. It's always a pleasure to be back in Luxembourg, although this is also the first time in this very nice building of the IB. We academics are used to somewhat different kinds of surroundings than this particular one. So I'm going to speak about inequality and in fact mostly family backgrounds. I've cheated a little bit, but I will have things to say about what I believe we now at this stage can learn from trying to think seriously about genes as well. So again, I have been for many years concerned with studying intergenerational associations, that is parent-child associations in economic outcomes, and somewhat more broadly in a sense that I'll outline later on in the importance of family background. That's a somewhat broader concept, but I'll try to motivate that. Now, for the genetic part of this talk, I'll very briefly comment on where the research frontier is now on genome-wide association studies. But then I'll talk a little more about population genetic models, which is where the bulk of the knowledge is on these topics. And I must warn those who, if they happen to be, to somewhat put it ironically, those who think we are genetic automata who are programmed to do and behave completely according to our genes and have little role for anything else. Anybody who has those beliefs, should we put it mildly, will feel compelled to comment angrily at me at the end of this talk, because I actually don't think that what we learn from the current state of knowledge on genetic models is necessarily very helpful if you worry very much about inequality. I think a lot can be learned, but inequality right now is not one of those things. With economic outcomes, we can understand a number of things here. Well, this may come to some as a surprise. A lot of the work that centers on genes and economic outcomes is in fact about cognitive ability and socio-emotional behaviors, what lots of people call non-cognitive abilities. My interest in inequality is on income. Primarily, I'm interested in disposable family income. And on that score, that's the kind of inequality I'm interested in. And that's the kind of inequality I think that we don't really learn very much about from thinking seriously about genes. Other things such as earnings, possibly somewhat more. We also are to some extent interested in education, often because it may be difficult for some groups or some people of some ages to measure income accurately, or in some data sets we don't have good measures of income. And then looking at educational outcomes can be a useful substitute. But the inequality in my title is really the distribution of such economic outcomes, preferably income and preferably disposable income. So that's, in a sense, that's a substantive issue that animates at least me. Now, intergenerational economic associations have been studied for quite some while. In fact, the whole statistical analysis of connections between different variables started from something quite similar, which is that Francis Galton in the 1880s was concerned about the association between offspring height, measured in inches, of course, because he was English, and parent height. So he formulated what is here equation 1 originally, with a y's being offspring and parent height, respectively. We do this for income, more than 100 years after Francis Galton. And there are two different interpretations of the slope coefficient here. The beta, which is the coefficient on parental income in accounting for child income. One is just a mechanical statistical number, which we can think of as a useful statistic in its own right. I'll say more about that later on. But economists like to think of it as actually capturing preferably the causal effect of manipulating parental income and seeing what it leads to in terms of child income. So there's actually economic theory which tells us what we should expect this thing to be like. And that economic theory is is due to Gary Becker and his then co-author Nigel Tomes, who after this work turned into a monk, which apparently is true. But anyway, so lots of people who study these things are inspired by this work by Gary Becker and Nigel Tomes. Gary Solon has written a somewhat simplified version of this. And what this tells us is that our measure of income for the child is a function of, we don't need to worry about the intercept here, but it depends essentially on two things. It depends on parental income, and it depends on inherent ability. We can think of this as intellectual ability, but it's modified by a number of parameters. One of them is the return to human capital, that is, how much we're rewarding in the labor market for the amount of human... Whoops, that wasn't too good. Let's hope there's not a lot of wiring beneath here. This may end very badly for me in that case. The return to human capital and the productivity of turning investments into human capital into actual human capital. So you can think of this as the effectiveness of the school production function. That's the theta. And then we have a parameter gamma, which measures the progressivity of human capital financing, really. And there's an additional equation, which I'm not showing here, which is the extent to which this inherent intellectual ability is transmitted from one generation to another. That's captured by a parameter lambda. We can think of this as genetic. It might be cultural as well. In this, Becker and Tomes don't necessarily have a view on that particular thing. Now, it turns out that the beta, the slope of the, if you will, the causal effect of parental income on offspring income depends on all these things in a stable equilibrium, which we'll get back to later on. So it depends, the persistence, the extent of parental income effects on child income increases the more productive human capital investments are, the greater the return to human capital in the labor market is, and the greater the heritability, the transmission of inherent ability from generation to generation is, and it decreases with progressivity in public education spending. Okay? Now, one of the interesting things about this is that what drives a higher association between parental income and offspring income, that is, increases the persistence of income across generations, are exactly the same things that drive cross-sectional inequality. What this means is that there's a positive association between cross-sectional inequality and persistence of income, something that Alan Kruger dubbed the Great Gatsby curve, and which Miles Korak, my colleague who was here a year ago, has also done, or there's a bunch of us who have done this, but this is Miles's version, and this is kind of the opposite of what people believed before. It was previously believed that you'd have more mobility, that is less persistence, the more inequality you have in the cross-section, or at best that they'd be independent. But in fact, both theoretically and, as it turns out, empirically, it turns out that there's a positive connection between these two. And this is something, if there's time, I'll actually get back to as well. Now, so let's skip that. Now, I think there's a better measure still of the importance of family background, and that's the sibling correlation. I won't bore you with the details. It's based on an extremely simple statistical model, but it gives an interpretation to the correlation. And the interpretation is this. We're looking at this parameter rho here, which is what you'd get if you'd sample pairs of siblings at random from the population and calculate their correlation coefficient. That's a reasonably natural measure of the association between brothers. If we do this for US brothers on their body mass index, it turns out that correlation is about 0.49. If we do it on their hourly wages, it turns out that correlation is 0.51. So the correlation of a physical characteristic such as body mass index is in fact lower than that of a reasonably complex socioeconomic trait such as hourly wages. And the nice thing about this measure is that we can think of it as the fraction of the variance that's accounted for by family background in the distribution of an economic trait. So in the US example, 49% of the variation in body mass index can be traced back to the family. 51% can be traced back to the to hourly wages. Now, there's another nice thing about this, which is the following. So take the hourly wages example. So we know 51% of the variance can be accounted for by family background. It can, again, in a very simple framework, be shown that if you take the association in parent and child hourly wages and square that, then the 51% you get on the sibling correlation is equal to the square of the parent-child correlation plus all other things that children in the same family share, but which is independent of the parent's characteristics. So this allows us to distinguish between the things that are transmitted in observable characteristics and the things that are transmitted in other, often very difficult to measure ways. And it turns out that these other shared factors are really important. So these are a bunch of sibling correlations from a number of countries. The US number in earnings is the same as in body mass index, about 0.39. The Swedish number is about 0.32. So in the US, about half of the variance in long run earnings is accounted for by family background. In Sweden, about 1/3. I'll skip the hourly part. And instead, I'll go to the decomposition. I have a somewhat different number here for the Swedish correlation for technical reasons. But here is what we've done for Sweden for this decomposition. So take the earnings number. It's a slightly different sample, and the methods are slightly different. But this says that around 1/4 of the variation in earnings for these Swedish men is accounted for by family background. Then we've taken the parent-child correlation, squared it, and this tells us that only 2% of the variation of earnings in Sweden can be accounted for by the father-son correlation. The rest, the bulk of this 24%, is from other things that these men share with their brothers. Nobody quite knows what these things are. It turns out it's not the neighborhoods they live in. We know that by comparing outcomes for people from the same neighborhoods. It's not the schools they live in necessarily, although there we're a little more hazy. But it's probably a lot of the things that are really difficult to observe within families, such as the transmission of family culture, reading of bedtime stories and whatnot. Whatever it is that the brothers share, possibly their interactions with each other. But again, nobody quite knows. But the point here is that this more complete measure of family background captures a lot more of the variation in the population than the parent-child associations do. Now, there are things that we don't capture with these measures. One of them is that because it's based on a comparison of siblings. In the examples I've shown, mostly brothers. But of course, parents may treat children differently. The prime example of that, of course, is primogeniture. But there are other things as well, that some, a child who is disadvantaged in some way, handicapped in some way, relative to the siblings, will probably receive more support from the parents. Younger children may be assisted in various ways by their elder siblings, which of course is a different thing than being the elder sibling who's not helped by the young siblings and so on. So these things are not captured by our measure, the sibling correlation, but they are certainly part of family background. We also, of course, I mean, this is in a sense trivial, that monozygotic twins share all of their genes. fraternal twins and other full siblings share on average half of their genes, but of course all of the genes we inherit from our parents directly. So this is a somewhat complicated thing. But then there's also the fact that we don't actually share all of the environmental experiences and shocks with our siblings. An important class of those I'll talk about a little later, but simple things such as the greater the difference in age between two siblings, for instance, the less they're subject to the same correlated shocks. But of course, there's no escaping the fact, and indeed departing from the Becker-Thoms Solon model, that some kind of transmission of some kind of underlying ability is going on. And of course, it's reasonably natural to turn to genetics to try to see what that might be about and if we can measure these things. So there's a big literature on this. I haven't found more recent good popular overviews of this than those by a substantial number of authors and separately by Charles Mansky in a special number of the Journal of Economic Perspectives from some years ago. But essentially there are two broad approaches to the study of genes and inequality. One is the more modern approach of looking at genome-wide association studies on the one hand, and then there's the more traditional approach of taking population genetic modeling. So the genome-wide association studies is where the research front is now. There's a tremendous amount of work being done, which is rapidly expanding because the cost of gene sequencing is declining very rapidly. And of course, because we have lots and lots of genes and statistical samples, and even populations tend to be substantially smaller than the number of possible genes. We have what a statistician might call a very big problem in that we have negative degrees of freedom for the most part, which is a problem we don't. These studies, of course, try effectively to deal with in various ways. It's quickly moving, it's very quickly expanding, but many of the insights it yields turn out into disappointments very quickly, because it turns out that associations with specific genetic markers and specific outcomes can be very hard to replicate in other data sets, in larger data sets, and in different populations. So even if there's a tremendous amount of activity going on here, and of course it's in many ways a very promising area of research, it hasn't, for two different reasons, yielded many insights into what we might think of as the genetic basis of economic inequality. And the two reasons are this. First of all, these genetic marker economic outcome studies tend to be in what we might call the first moments. That is, that it associates specific genetic markers with the average of the level of some economic trait. It doesn't yet tell us very much about how this thing affects the distribution of the trait. But inequality is all about distribution, so we don't necessarily yet get a lot of leverage here. And the other, of course, is that this field is moving so rapidly that what economists like to call stylized facts of it aren't well established as of yet. So while this is definitely an area in which also many economists both do and should be doing work, it's an area which doesn't, as of yet, inform us very much about genes and inequality. And indeed, I'll skip this. This is just a lengthy quote which tells us that replication studies tend to discover a phenomenon which plagues a lot of social science right now, is that a lot of what are thought to be statistically significant findings turn out to be type 1 errors. If any of you remember your basic class in statistics. So anyway, the acceptance of a false null hypothesis, the acceptance of a false alternative hypothesis when the null hypothesis is in fact true. Now, population genetic models have been around for quite long. In fact, they stem from periods before people knew that DNA existed, long before that. And they're surprisingly popular. But they rely on a few simple, often in fact two simple ideas. Essentially, they work on the idea of Mendelian inheritance mainly. And the bulk of these studies, or at least very, very many of these studies, use twin data. They distinguish between monozygotic and dizygotic twins, often based, in fact, on self-reports, and whether or not the twins have been reared together or apart. And of course, monozygotic twins who have been reared apart, in a sense, are the ideal case, because any similarity in their outcome must be driven by the fact that they have common genes, until you discover that in fact these people tended to be separated reasonably late in their childhood. And in the data sets we're actually looking at, in some of them, the kids, one of the twins might have been adopted away to the childless sister of the parents, and in fact lived in the same village as his identical twins and so on. But this is a sideshow. So all of the same, these studies provide a lot of information. And the aim in these studies is to figure out what the heritability of a particular trait or outcome is. And it relies on a simple view of the phenotype of some property, some characteristic is as essentially an additive function of genetic factors and environmental factors. Y equals capital G plus E, and then the capital E, the environmental factors, are further divided into shared environmental factors, the things that are shared among people who have some degree of kinship, and those that are not. So that's the U. And so the kinds of models people estimate are essentially boiled down to, in this case, an earnings model where we have the long-run earnings of an individual depending on some kind of underlying latent genetic makeup, loading onto earnings with a factor loading G, the shared environment latent variable loading onto earnings with a factor S, and then the unshared environment also loading on with some factor U. To get anywhere with this, we need to simplify matters in various ways, and the typical simplifications involve the normalization of the variance to 1 of the outcome, and also these G's, S's, and U's, which are unobservable variables, we also normalize their variance to 1. So then we can simply rewrite the population variance in the trait as being 1 and being the sum of these factor loadings squared, the G squared, the S squared, and the U squared. And here now, G squared is the heritability of a trait. That is the extent to which the population variance in a trait is accounted for by genetic variation. Now, the way in which we then go about estimating heritability and the importance of shared environment is by calculating correlations in the earnings or the IQ or the socio-emotional behaviors of relatives of various kinship degrees. So if Y denotes, for instance, my earnings, and Y prime denotes that of my brother or my mother or my father or my uncle or my cousin, then we can express the covariance here, or the correlation, because we've normalized stuff to have a unit variance, as the sum of the covariances of the genetic materials, the shared environments, which these, I'm sorry, that's a typo, these should be the unshared environments, and then a bunch of covariances. And we need to put a number of restrictions to get any place. And of course, by the definition of an unshared environment, the thing that here erroneously doesn't involve a u but should, and all the cross terms that involve the u's, they're all 0 by construction. Okay? But that still leaves us with one cross covariance, that is that between the genetic factor and the shared environment. And it turns out, of course, that what you assume about this is crucial to what you're going to be finding here. So the non-shared environments we do set to 0, but then we have to put even more structure to get any place. One of the things that you do is that you assume away non-random mating. That is, that people associate with each other as if the genetic makeup was irrelevant to that. And then you assume away dominant gene effects and non-additive gene effects. And if you do all of these things, then the correlation of the genetic latent variables across siblings is going to be 1 for identical twins, or monozygotic twins to be more precise, 0.5 for full siblings, including fraternal twins, and 0.25 for half siblings. Those are the Mendelian correlations under the assumptions I've just stated. Then, assuming that shared environment is an on-off thing, for the reared together, the covariance of the shared environment is 1, and for the reared apart, shared environment has a 0 correlation. So the design matrix of the most basic model for the kinds of siblings that I'll show you data on in a minute, in fact, I'll show data only for one, but the ones we use in the paper that underlies this is that we have monozygotic and dizygotic twins who have been reared together and apart. These are based on a Swedish twin registry. They're by now very old by the time we measure their characteristics, so some of the results are a little odd. Don't want to repeat the same mistake. And then we also use other kinds of siblings. So we know from population registers if people are full or half siblings, and we also can observe them either living in the same household or not. So we know if they're full, half, living together, living apart. And we also have some adopted siblings. But because of the nature of adoption, of course, you only observe adopted siblings actually living together. That's like the definition of adoption. But we can work out then what these covariances are. Then we go out and measure the correlations of these different types of sibling pairs. And then essentially we estimate heritability by the coefficient on this column. And we estimate the impact of the importance of shared environment as the coefficient on this column. Okay? What we're then going to do is we're going to open these restrictive assumptions that are associated with these things here. And I'm going to show you, I'll show you what those assumptions are, and then I'll show you the impact on the monozygotic twin genetic versus shared environment component. The paper that's in the background here, we have full results, but I'm going to show you only these. So we try 3 different things on this score. We allow the gene environment correlation to be non-zero in that we essentially think that biological siblings who are reared together have 1 gene environment correlation. Those biological twins who have, biological siblings who live in separate households to have a different environment, and then adoptive siblings we think have a 3rd one. So we, in a sense, we plug in specific numbers into these places. We do a separate thing of this, that is that we allow these gene correlations to be different from what you do when you make the restrictive assumptions of no dominant gene effects, no non-additive gene effects, and also non-random mating. And we essentially allow the correlations to be different for identical twins, fraternal twins, and half siblings and adoptive siblings. Again, we allow for a better fit of the model. And finally, we think of shared environment as being not necessarily on and off. So we allow for the possibility that monozygotic twins reared together in fact share more of the same environment than others. Fraternal twins share more shared environment than other siblings reared together, and these again more than siblings reared apart do. And the result for monozygotic, or the consequences for monozygotic twins, the raw correlation for whom is 0.36 in these data. These are the identical twins who were born quite some while ago. We see that the genetic component for these varies from a lot relative to environmental component to being, in fact, not exactly equal, but close to equal. So depending on what you assume about these things, even in this very simple population genetic model, genes can either account for the overwhelming part of the similarity of things like monozygotic twins, or for much less than in the base case. And nobody quite knows what these numbers really should be. So this has been an exercise, if you will, in checking out the robustness. In a statistical sense, all three of these models where we allow things to be different than in the original statistically dominate this one. But which of these is best, we don't really have an answer to. Now, there are a few additional remarks to be made, and in many ways I think this is where the interesting stuff can be done on population genetic models. And one is that we know now from a number of studies, including the study of the Chernobyl radiation fallout, how it affected Swedish children who were in utero when the cloud was passing Sweden. We know it from children who are in utero when the Spanish flu was afflicting populations across Europe in 1918. And we know from a bunch of other sources that so-called in utero shocks are really very important for outcomes. They, in fact, have even transgenerational effects. And of course, population genetic model assumes that all of the similarity between twins is driven by their similar genetic makeup, and ignores the fact that they in fact also shared the womb during 9 months that preceded birth. So it mixes up. So the proper way of treating G here is to think of it as pre-birth factors rather than purely genetic. We also, because we normalize the variances and only work with construction, by construction we abstract from distributional dynamics. So these models are essentially silent on why inequalities of traits change across time within countries. We can't really answer that question because we, in a sense, assume it away. Now, despite these caveats, I think population genetic analysis of family associations can still be used to provide useful insights and structure and understanding, but it requires a reasonably open mind and also a departure from the very simple twin studies and the very simple strict Mendelian simplified correlations that I just showed you. But one of the most striking points about this was made by the statistician and economist Arthur Goldberger almost 20 years ago in a lecture he gave at the University College London on the invitation of another giant in inequality research, Tony Atkinson, in one of the best papers I've still ever read in economics called Heritability. And it's a very good discussion about population genetic modeling, in this case of the heritability of IQ. But on policy, Art's remarks, I think, were very insightful. So take an example of a non-economic trait of myopia, nearsightedness. And think about the policy implications of its heritability. I think it's reasonable to assume that myopia is highly heritable. I don't even know, in fact, what the heritability estimates for that are, but for simplicity, let's assume it's 1. That is, myopia is completely driven by your genetic makeup. Now, what many of the people who believe that genes are really important infer from that observation is that there's nothing you can do about inequality. It's genetically driven, end of story. And Art cited people who said, well, the commission on thinking about social progress might as well just pack up and go home, because nothing can be done about inequality. The heritability is so high. But again, take myopia. There's an extremely simple policy option available, and that's the distribution of eyeglasses to the people who suffer from myopia. Problem essentially solved, despite the fact that it's 100% heritable. Now, the point of this story is to say that these heritability estimates on their own do not inform us about whether or not some disadvantage can be corrected for by policy or not. The question of whether or not you can address inequalities by policy must be found elsewhere. And the point made by Charles Mansky, and in fact by Arthur Goldberger and the Oscar Kempthorne, the statistician that Charles Mansky cites here, is essentially to say that whether or not some disadvantage can be addressed using policy is an issue that must be studied in the world where such policies are tried out and measured for their effectiveness. The heritability of the disadvantage doesn't inform us on that score. And this is one of the reasons why the population genetic research, I mean, it yields interesting insights, and I've personally done some of it, mostly, in fact, to learn the methods. But if you want to learn about what you can do about inequality, then you probably need to turn to other kinds of methods. Now, I'm reasonably close to finishing, but I'm going to say a few things, and in fact, I'll give you an example of a study which actually looks at the policy effectiveness, but I will say a couple of things before that. One is to repeat that if it's the dynamics of economic inequality that interests us, then at least at this point of our knowledge, we're probably best advised to look at other things than the genetic makeup of the population. And even if you were to look at that, there's still a lot of interesting stuff to be looked at apart from genetics. And I'll look at a few of those. But this point about the dynamics of inequality, I think, is an important one. So this is taken from the World Inequality Database, which is was created by a number of researchers, including Tony Atkinson and Thomas Piketty, and is situated in the Paris School of Economics. This shows the share of the top 1% of US income across roughly 1913 to 2014, and also the share of the bottom 50% in the red line here. But focusing on the top 1%, which is a popular measure of inequality in this top income inequality literature, it went from roughly 10% to roughly 20% in a period of about 20 years, from 1980 to 2014. Now, that's a big change. That's a doubling of their share, of the income share. Now, I'm all for lots of different kinds of analysis, but I would venture a guess to say that to study such a big change in inequality across a single generation, I think one is probably best advised to look for the explanations otherwhere than in the genetic makeup of the populations involved. Of course, if we're interested in, there are many legitimate reasons to be interested in genes, but I don't think the understanding of such changes across time is one of them. Now, I will show an example of a specific reform which was studied using quasi-experimental methods that suggested a very large change in the importance of family background. And that's comprehensive school reform in Finland. This is work done by colleagues of mine. I've continued to do it in the Family Association interpretation of things, but here I'll just talk about the work that was done by my Finnish colleagues. So what comprehensive school reform in Finland did was it moved the age at which children are tracked into academic and non-academic tracks from age 11 to age 16. as a consequence of that, when children had previously been separated into different schools depending on track at age 11, now they went to the same track until age 16, until the separation into academic and non-academic education took place. And also, as a further consequence, they all studied the same curriculum across those last 5 years of compulsory schooling. Now, this was implemented in such a way as to open up for quasi-experimental analysis, in that the reform was implemented in 5 stages, starting in the north of the country and ending in the capital Helsinki, between the years 1972 and 77, affecting birth cohorts 1961 to 1965. So what my colleagues did was that they compared the income association of the children who went to the non-comprehensive school to that of the income association between those who went to comprehensive school, and used the fact that you could, during the same outcome year, for the same birth cohorts, observe people in the 2 different systems. And the results, and this is the last table I'm going to show, are here. My preferred estimates are the last column. It includes the most controls. The original persistence estimate, that is the persistence between son and father earnings, the beta I started off with, was around 0.3 before the reform started. This could be contrasted, in fact, by Galton's estimate of 0.6 between heights of children and their parents, which in fact is quite close to the US estimate, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. So 0.3, this is approximately what you observe in Great Britain for cohorts active about 10 years ago or so. So this is in the mid-range of the so-called Great Gatsby curve. The reform itself didn't have a big effect, depending on what you control for. It essentially didn't affect the outcomes of the children adversely. The point estimate suggests a small decline in average income, but that's not statistically significant. What's highly statistically significant, however, is the effect of the reform. The effect of the reform is to reduce this 0.3 approximately by 0.07 points. So Finland went from having the same level of persistence as the United Kingdom to have the level of persistence that's observed today, or roughly one fourth of the persistence was knocked off by comprehensive school reform. And again, this is a very big change as these things come and go. We don't observe changes of that magnitude in persistence measured across time almost anywhere. So this is a very big change affected by it's a reasonably inexpensive and in some ways quite simple school reform, which is just to not track children at a very young age, but allow that tracking to take place at a much later age. A reduction in the importance of family background, an increase in the equality of opportunity of a magnitude that separates what we think of as a reasonably high persistence country to a low persistence one. And again, this of course cannot reasonably be driven by any changes in the population makeup, because we're essentially comparing children born to the same families but just affected by different kinds of school systems. And that's where I'll close. Thank you.